Hello, my name is Andy Staples. I'm the Director of Research and Outreach for the Hinrich Foundation based here in Singapore. I'm joined today by one of our research fellows, Alex Capri, who's also a visiting fellow at NUS Business School, also here in Singapore. Alex, thanks for joining us. We are just about to publish the latest paper in a series that you've been publishing with us under the title of Techno-nationalism. This latest one is titled Techno-nationalism and Corporate Governance. Just give us a quick overview of that paper, the key themes and issues that you're looking at.
Certainly. So let's start with techno-nationalism itself, which means essentially that non-state and state actors are now in this relationship where governments are tying technological prowess and strength to economic issues, to national security issues, and social stability issues, which means that they're looking to control and influence their local players and their so-called national champions when it comes to all issues around tech.
And going on to think about this particular paper where you're talking about corporate governance, you map out three key areas of state activism, local versus global, and then a final section looking at sort of new frontiers around fintech, regtech, and so on. Could you bring that to life a little bit for us?
Certainly. So state activism, again, in the context of techno-nationalism, means that governments are looking to assert much more influence on companies, on multinationals, and their behavior, certainly when it comes to either sensitive or restricted technologies. And in that context, that would involve either blocking acquisitions or putting very stringent demands on acquisitions and partnerships involving Chinese companies, for example. It would involve placing, in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, putting party members on corporate boards, essentially, of all the key Chinese companies, or forming special committees to make sure that there's an alignment of corporate behavior with Beijing's policies. On the flip side to that, in the United States, we're seeing the U.S. government beginning to really push and really look to influence not just American companies, but its allies overseas. And we've seen that with the Clean Networks program and initiative, for example. So it's a much higher degree of government activism.
And going into that sort of second major theme of local versus global, I wondered if you could give us an example of actually what this means for, say, a US multinational operating in China.
So take, for example, a company like Apple or a company like Microsoft, two iconic American brands that have very well articulated global corporate policies when it comes to specific values around, for example, privacy or certainly freedom of expression. When those companies are operating in China, they're having to adhere to local laws, which contrast with the global policies of those companies and most Western, if you will, or American companies. And in China, they will have to censor content from their platforms. And they will have to essentially waive privacy rights for their customers, for example, in the case of turning over data. So that creates an inherent conflict between global policy and local regulations, which we're seeing across a number of fronts, including data localization, privacy, and so on.
And my understanding is that many firms have tried to deal with this by adopting a in China, for China type of policy. But how viable is that in this sort of increasingly politicized environment in which they're operating?
Yeah, and well, certainly to ring fence, a local business because of the local legal requirements. In China for China is a typical example of that, but it could be in India for India. It could be in the United States for the United States, and so on, which is an indication of how techno-nationalism is causing a fragmentation of global value chains and is really increasing localized operations. So that increases costs, of course, and that makes corporate governance much more complicated.
So we've heard quite a bit about this idea of the bifurcation of technology, of decoupling. Indeed, one of your earlier papers was looking at strategic decoupling. This you would see as evidence for all of that unplaying.
Absolutely. And what we're seeing, Andy, is a sort of fragmentation of global value chains in three separate streams. The first stream is the strategic stream. That's where we have all of the really sensitive technologies with controls that require a completely separate effort when it comes to tracing and monitoring and managing from a governance standpoint. The second stream is a much larger area, but it's a big gray area because it involves dual use technologies, meaning they can be used for both commercial and military applications. And at any point, they can go from not requiring a license or not requiring any kind of special certifications to being restricted literally overnight. And so that's really that's what I call the cautionary zone in global value chains. That's really the tough area to monitor. And then the third stream is essentially the innocuous everyday stuff that everybody takes for granted, shampoo, wearing apparel, that type of thing. That will continue, essentially the way it's always been. But from a corporate governance standpoint, dealing with those three variations of global value chains is going to become quite challenging and is going to require a lot more resources, of which in the final section I talk about IT, trade tech, and reg tech as tools to manage that.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for taking us through that paper. I should note that it's available on our website, hinrichfoundation.com. And you can download the whole paper there and also find some other related materials on this theme of techno-nationalism, including, of course, all the previous papers in Alex's series. Well, with that, thank you for joining us. Okay.